Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of his ship looking at something that should not exist. The old records called it the Citadel of the Stellar Knights, but everyone said those were just stories. Now Jake was looking at a massive structure, floating dead in space with broken towers that once glowed with strange light. His ship, the UES Defender, had found it by accident while mapping this empty part of space. "Captain, I am getting life signs from inside that thing," said Lieutenant Kate Sullivan from her station. Her voice carried surprise because nothing should be alive in there after 500 years. Jake had always been different from other human officers. While most people in the year 2387 focused on trade routes and territory disputes, Jake spent his free time reading old stories about heroes. The other species in the galaxy thought humans were too young and wild to matter much. They had only joined the Galactic Federation 30 years ago, and most aliens still saw them as newcomers, who got lucky with space travel. But Jake believed the old stories were real. He had studied everything he could find about the Stellar Knights, who had protected the galaxy for 10,000 years. They were warriors who used both advanced weapons and something called the inner light. This inner light came from having a pure heart and strong beliefs about protecting others. The knights had been peacekeepers who could heal the sick and defeat evil with just their willpower. Then 500 years ago, they all disappeared without explanation. The galaxy moved on and developed new technology, but things got worse without the knights. Wars became more brutal, and people became more selfish. Many worlds suffered under cruel rulers who would never have dared challenge the knights. "Take us in for docking," Jake ordered. "Ben, you are with me." Lieutenant Ben Hayes was Jake's best friend and tactical officer. He followed Jake into the ancient station even though it seemed dangerous. The artificial gravity still worked, which meant some incredible power source was still running deep inside the structure. They walked through empty corridors filled with dust and shadows until they reached a great central chamber. There, sitting in meditation pose, was an incredibly old being who looked almost human, but with silver skin and eyes like stars. This was Master Valdris, the last stellar knight alive. "You came," whispered the ancient knight. His voice sounded like wind blowing through empty space. "I felt it in the cosmic currents. Humanity has finally arrived." Jake started to explain that they were just on a survey mission, but Valdris held up his hand. The old master had been waiting alone for centuries, knowing that someday the right species would find him. "Your Federation friends only see the surface of things," said Valdris. "They have forgotten that real strength comes from the light inside. A person not from big weapons or large armies. Your species still remembers what honor means. You still dream of being heroes." Valdris told them the real truth about what happened to the knights. They had not died in battle or from disease. They had chosen to leave when the galaxy decided technology was more important than wisdom and force was better than justice. The knights hid their weapons and knowledge, waiting for a species that could bring back the old ways of protecting others. "Dark times are coming," warned Valdris. "The Void Syndicate moves between stars, draining hope from entire worlds. Without knights to stop them, whole sectors will fall into despair and death." As if his words had summoned them, alarms started ringing throughout the station. Ben's radio crackled with urgent reports from their ship. "Captain, we have unknown ships approaching. Fast. They are sending out some kind of signal that is making our crew feel hopeless and afraid." Through the windows, Jake saw sleek black ships that seemed to eat light instead of reflecting it. These vessels looked wrong in a way that made his stomach feel sick. The Void Syndicate had found them. "It begins now," said Valdris, struggling to stand up. "But maybe it also ends here. Will you learn human? Will you take up the burden your species was born to carry?" Jake felt something warm growing in his chest as he looked at the approaching enemy ships. His crew was in danger, and innocent people across the galaxy were suffering. Someone had to stand up to this evil, and maybe humans were meant to be those protectors. "What do I need to do?" Jake asked. "First, you must survive this battle," replied Valdris. "Then you must learn to kindle the inner light. The galaxy forgot what knights could do, but you will remind them." The enemy ships were almost in weapon range. Now, and Jake knew his normal guns would not be enough against this strange foe. But something deep inside told him that he was meant to be here at this moment facing this choice. Humanity had come to the stars and found their true purpose waiting for them in the darkness. The battle lasted 18 hours, and Jake watched his crew slowly losing their minds. The Void Syndicate ships did not just shoot regular weapons at them. They sent out waves of pure sadness and hopelessness that made people forget why they wanted to live. Jake saw his officers sitting at their stations with blank stares, unable to remember what they were fighting for. "Shields are failing," reported Kate Sullivan, but her voice sounded flat and empty. "I cannot remember why we are trying to fight these ships." Jake felt the same attack hitting his mind, but something strange happened. Instead of feeling hopeless, he felt a warm feeling growing stronger in his chest. The enemy was trying to fill him with despair, but he found something inside that pushed back against it. "Ben, take 5 volunteers and follow me," Jake ordered. Valdris said there are weapons in this station that work differently than normal guns. The old knight was waiting for them in a room filled with crystal swords and armor that glowed with soft inner light. The weapons looked beautiful, but when Ben reached for one of the swords, nothing happened. It remained cold and dark in his hands. "They do not respond to need or want," explained Valdris. "They respond to absolute certainty that you will protect others no matter what it costs you personally." Jake stepped forward and grasped one of the crystal blades. Immediately bright light erupted from the weapon, and he felt power flowing through his whole body. It was not just physical strength, but a perfect clarity about who he was meant to be. For the first time in his life, Jake knew exactly what his purpose was. "The armor chooses its wearer," said Valdris as Jake approached one of the glowing suits. "It will only bond with those who understand that true power serves others, never the self." The armor flowed over Jake like liquid starlight, fitting perfectly to his body. Through its enhanced senses, he could see the enemy attack differently. What had seemed like an unstoppable wave of despair was actually just a kind of poison that could be cleaned away. Jake returned to the bridge where his crew was ready to surrender. But when he entered the room, his presence began pushing back the darkness. The armor made his natural ability to inspire others much stronger. "Kate, remember why you joined the space fleet," Jake said with a voice that carried impossible conviction. "Remember the first time you saw the stars and knew you belonged among them." The light inside him reached out to her, and Kate's eyes became clear again. "I remember everything now," she said with wonder in her voice. One by one the crew recovered their sense of purpose and hope. But the real test came when Jake took a small shuttle directly to the lead enemy ship. He cut through their hull with his crystal sword, and the weapon sang with sounds that shattered their despair machines. The Syndicate warriors inside were beings who had given up their inner light long ago. They had become empty vessels filled with cosmic despair that they spread to others. But Jake discovered that his night training let him see tiny sparks of goodness still buried deep inside them. Instead of killing them, Jake used his blade to cut away their connection to the void. Some fell unconscious, but others staggered back to awareness. Their eyes cleared for the first time in decades as they remembered what it felt like to hope. "This is impossible," hissed their commander through a translator device. "The knights are all dead. We consumed them centuries ago." "No," replied Jake, advancing with his sword raised. "You only consumed the memory of them, but memories can be restored." When Jake struck the final blow, it was not to destroy but to free. The commander's scream was not one of death, but of a mind suddenly freed from artificial darkness that had controlled it. For years, as the Syndicate fleet retreated, Valdris smiled at Jake with something like fatherly pride. The old master had waited 500 years to see this moment. "The first light has been kindled," said Valdris. "But one night cannot restore the order. You must find others among your people, and you must learn that this path will cost you everything you think you want to give you, everything you never knew you needed." Jake understood that this was just the beginning. Somewhere in human space, there were others who carried the potential to become knights. They would need to be found and trained and tested. The galaxy had forgotten what it meant to have protectors who served others before themselves. "How will I know who can become a knight?" asked Jake. You will recognize them, replied Valdris. They are the ones who choose to do right even when no one is watching. They are the ones who help others even when it brings them no benefit. They are the ones who refuse to compromise their principles no matter what it costs them. Jake looked at his crystal sword still glowing with inner light. He was no longer just a ship captain. He had become something the galaxy had not seen in 5 centuries. He was a night recruiter whose job was to find others who could kindle their own inner light. The Void Syndicate would return with larger fleets and stronger weapons. Other species would fear and resist the return of the Knights. There would be battles and sacrifices and moments when the darkness seemed too strong to overcome, but Jake had felt the power of the inner light and he knew it was real. Humanity had come to the stars and found their destiny waiting for them. They would become the protectors the galaxy needed, even if the galaxy did not want them. 6 months after the battle at the Citadel, Jake Morrison was no longer just a ship captain. He had become something new called a night recruiter, traveling between human colonies looking for people who might have the inner light. His job was to find those rare individuals who could become the protectors the galaxy needed. He found Lisa Grant on a frontier world called New Texas, where she worked as a sheriff protecting settlers from raiders. Lisa had been a Marine until she refused an order to bomb innocent civilians. She left the military rather than compromise her principles, and now she kept the peace with nothing but an old plasma rifle and unshakable determination to protect others. When raiders attacked the settlement, Jake showed Lisa what a crystal sword could do. He deflected an entire energy barrage from the raider ship and sent it back at them. The enemy vessel was disabled but not destroyed, and the raiders inside were knocked unconscious but alive. Where can I get one of those swords? Asked Lisa after seeing the demonstration. It is not about the weapon, explained Jake as they checked on the unconscious raiders. It is about becoming someone worthy to carry it. Lisa thought she was tough from her military training, but night training was harder than anything she had ever experienced. Valdris had taught Jake that night power came from perfect alignment of thoughts, emotions, and actions in service of protecting others. This required not just physical discipline, but spiritual purification that stripped away ego, fear, and personal wants. I cannot stop thinking about my ex-husband, Lisa confessed during a meditation session. I keep feeling angry about how he abandoned me when I needed him most. The anger is not the problem, Jake taught her, repeating lessons from Valdris. The problem is holding on to anger. Let it flow through you like water. Feel it, learn from it, then release it and move on. Their third recruit was Dr. Paul Martinez, a scientist who studied alien biology. Paul had discovered that several alien species were suffering from what he called spiritual decay. It was a gradual loss of meaning and purpose that spread across worlds like a disease. This is not just psychological, Paul explained as he joined their small group aboard the ship. Jake had renamed U.S. Honor Guard. There is a measurable decrease in what I can only call life force, the energy that separates living beings from dead organic matter. The Void Syndicate, realized Jake. They are not just spreading sadness. They are literally draining the life out of entire species. Their fourth member found them instead of the other way around. Commander Susan Blake had been a military intelligence officer until she was court-martialed for refusing to participate in a cover-up of civilian casualties. She tracked down Jake's ship and requested permission to come aboard. I have been studying patterns in syndicate attacks, she explained, spreading holographic star charts across their briefing table. They are not random raids. They are systematically targeting worlds with the highest recorded instances of people helping others. Places where beings still believe in sacrifice for the common good. They are hunting hope itself, said Paul, understanding, dawning in his voice. Which means they know something we do not, continued Susan. They are afraid of what happens when someone truly lives by those qualities they are trying to destroy. The fifth recruit changed everything they thought they knew about the inner light. Amy Chun was only 19 years old and worked as a communications technician on a deep space monitoring station. When Syndicate forces attacked her facility, she held them off for 6 hours using nothing but mining equipment and absolute refusal to let them destroy research data that could save thousands of lives. When Jake tested Amy's potential with one of the crystal swords, the weapon blazed with light so intense it could be seen through solid walls. Everyone stared in amazement at the young woman who had made the ancient weapon shine brighter than anyone had ever seen. "How is that even possible?" whispered Lisa. "She has never compromised," explained Valdris when they reported back to the Citadel. "Every choice she has ever made has been guided by what she believed was right, regardless of personal cost. Such purity of purpose is extremely rare in any species." "But she is so young," protested Paul. "The Night Path is not about age," replied the old master. "It is about the moment when a soul decides it would rather die than betray its deepest beliefs. Some find that moment at 90 years old. Others, like young Amy, have never lived without it." As their group trained together, Jake began to understand why the galaxy had lost its knights. It was not just that the old knights had withdrawn from service. Most species had evolved beyond the capacity for the absolute moral clarity that knighthood required. They had become too sophisticated and willing to accept necessary evils and convenient compromises, but humans were still young enough to believe. In heroes, they were still naive enough to think one person could make a difference. They were still stubborn enough to choose the hard right path over the easy wrong one. "We are not just restoring an ancient order," Jake realized as he watched. Amy helped Lisa master a difficult meditation technique. "We are becoming something new. Something the galaxy has never seen before." The 5 human knights practiced together every day, learning to work as a team. They studied the old records and trained with their crystal weapons. Most importantly, they learned to trust the inner light that connected them to each other and to all living things. Jake knew their real test was coming soon. The Void Syndicate would not ignore what had happened at the Citadel. They would return with greater force and new weapons designed specifically to counter the Knights. Other species in the galaxy would demand explanations, and some would try to stop the Knights from interfering in their affairs, but Jake also knew they were ready. 5 humans had kindled the inner light and proven that heroes could still exist in a galaxy that had forgotten what heroism meant. Soon there would be more, and the ancient order of knights would rise again stronger than ever before. The emergency call came from the Zephyrian Council, one of the most important founding members of the Galactic Federation. Their beautiful homeworld was under attack by the largest Void Syndicate fleet anyone had ever seen. Normal military forces had tried to fight them, but the enemy's despair weapons made conventional defense impossible. "They are not just attacking our cities," explained Ambassador Kixith through the subspace transmission. His normally musical Zephyrian voice was strained with exhaustion and fear. "They are attacking our ability to remember why those cities are worth defending. Half our population has simply stopped caring about anything. They sit in their homes staring at nothing, waiting to die." Jake looked around the briefing room at his small group of knights. 5 humans against a fleet that had broken entire star systems. The odds were completely hopeless by any reasonable measure. "We go," he decided without hesitation. "Captain," said Susan Blake carefully, "I have run tactical projections on this situation. Even with our abilities, we cannot possibly defeat a force that large." "We are not going to win a battle," Jake interrupted. "We are going to prove something important." Valdris said the knights withdrew because the galaxy chose darkness over light. Maybe it is time to show them what real light looks like. The journey to Zephyria took them through 3 separate syndicate blockades. Each time, instead of fighting their way through, Jake led his knights in what he called the cleansing charge. They flew directly at enemy ships using their crystal weapons, not to destroy the vessels, but to purge the void influence from the crews inside. "This is working too well," observed Paul after their second encounter. "The crews we have freed are joining our formation. We are not just breaking through enemy lines. We are liberating an entire fleet, ship by ship." By the time they reached Zephyria, their single ship had grown into a formation of 12 vessels. Former syndicate ships now crewed by beings who had rediscovered their capacity for hope, were following the Knights toward a world that had almost given up on itself, but the real challenge waited on the planet's surface. The Void Syndicate had deployed something completely new called despair engines. These massive devices projected waves of existential hopelessness across entire continents. Millions of Zephyrians lay motionless in the streets, not dead but empty, with their life force slowly being drained away. "The engines are protected by nullification fields," reported Amy after scanning the target area. "Any technology that gets within a kilometer simply stops working. Our ships, our weapons, even our armor will be useless." "Then we go in without technology," said Jake, beginning to remove his crystal armor and setting aside everything except his sword. "Sir, that is suicide," protested Lisa. "No," replied Jake, finally understanding something fundamental about knighthood. "That is faith." The walk to the first despair engine was the hardest thing any of them had ever attempted. With each step forward, the weight of cosmic meaninglessness pressed down on them like a physical force. The universe itself seemed to whisper that nothing they did mattered and all their struggles were pointless exercises in futility. Amy was the first to falter, falling to her knees as tears streamed down her face. "I cannot remember why we are doing this anymore. What is the point of any of it?" But instead of losing hope, Jake felt something crystallize within his soul. "Because they cannot remember," he said, helping Amy back to her feet. "Because someone has to remember for all of them." Paul collapsed next, overwhelmed by visions of every patient he had failed to save and every cure he had failed to discover. Susan stumbled as the weight of every classified atrocity she had witnessed in intelligence work crashed down on her consciousness. Lisa nearly broke when the void showed her images of every person she had failed to protect during her career. But each time one of them fell, the others formed a protective circle around them. Their combined inner light pushed back against the artificial despair like a candle flame refusing to be extinguished by hurricane winds. They did not fight the darkness by denying it existed. Instead, they acknowledged it as part of existence and chose to keep walking anyway. This is what it really means, Jake realized as they approached the massive despair engine. Not to be without fear or doubt or pain, but to carry all of those things and still choose to protect others because it is right. When Amy raised her crystal sword and drove it deep into the engine's core, the explosion of light was visible from orbital distance. Across the entire continent, Zephyrians began to stir and sit up, remembering who they were and why their lives had meaning and purpose, but their victory was only partial. 4 more engines remained active, and Jake's knights were exhausted with their inner light burning dangerously low. They had proven the engines could be destroyed, but at this rate the effort would kill them before they could finish the mission. That was when unexpected reinforcements arrived from space. Jake's communicator crackled with an incoming transmission. "UES Honor Guard, this is Captain Roy Kim of the UES Determination. We have 40 volunteers from the human colonial fleet, all requesting immediate night training. Permission to land and provide assistance." Jake smiled as he watched the ships descending through the atmosphere. They were filled with ordinary humans from every walk of life, farmers and engineers and teachers and shopkeepers, people who had heard stories about the Knights and decided that someone needed to stand between the darkness and everything they loved. "Permission granted," Jake replied, feeling hope surge through his exhausted body. "Let us finish this mission together." The volunteers had no training and no crystal weapons, but they had something just as important. They had made the choice to risk everything for others, and that choice itself was a form of inner light that the despair engines could not extinguish. The liberation of Zephyr became the moment that changed everything in the galaxy forever. Within weeks, the news networks were broadcasting images of humans in glowing crystal armor, carrying swords that blazed with inner light as they freed entire star systems from void corruption. But more important than the battles were the scenes that came after the fighting ended. Jake Morrison knelt beside a young Zephyrian child who had been caught in a despair engine field for months. The boy had not spoken or eaten or even acknowledged that other people existed since the attack. His parents thought he was lost forever, but when Jake placed his armored hand gently on the child's shoulder. Something passed between them. It was not power or magic, but simple recognition. The understanding that the boy's pain was real and valid, but so was his capacity for joy and wonder. Jake did not try to fix everything with knight abilities. He just showed the child that someone cared enough to sit with him in his darkness. "The stars," whispered the boy, speaking his first words in half a year. "They are singing again like they used to." Similar scenes played out across dozens of worlds as the knights and their human volunteers worked to heal the damage left by void attacks. They brought not just medical supplies and rebuilding materials, but something more precious. They brought the stubborn human conviction that any problem could be solved if enough people cared enough to try. "The media is calling it the New Dawn," reported Susan Blake during a strategy meeting aboard the Honor Guard. 17 different species have formally requested night protection for their worlds. The Andromedan Collective wants to establish a joint training program to create their own knights. But Jake was troubled by other reports that Susan shared with the group. "What about the resistance movements?" he asked. Dr. Paul Martinez brought up holographic displays showing protest rallies on multiple Federation worlds. 3 major species are demanding that all night activities be regulated by government oversight. They are calling us dangerous idealists and a threat to galactic stability. The opposition was led by something called the Rationalist Coalition. This was an alliance of species who had long ago decided that emotions and faith were evolutionary weaknesses that intelligent beings should overcome. They viewed the knight's success with deep suspicion and growing fear. "They are right to be afraid of us," observed Amy Chun quietly. She had become the youngest person ever to achieve the rank of Knight Commander, and her natural gift for the inner light inspired awe even among experienced knights. "We are not just fighting the Void Syndicate. We are proving that their entire worldview is wrong." The confrontation came to a head at the Galactic Assembly on Nexus Prime. Jake found himself standing before representatives of 1,000 different worlds, defending not just humanity's actions, but the very concept that some things were absolutely right or wrong regardless of circumstances. "The Knights claim to serve justice," declared Speaker Vorth of the Rationalist Coalition. His cybernetically enhanced voice echoed through the great assembly chamber. "But who has the right to define what justice means? By what authority do they impose their primitive values on advanced civilizations?" "We do not impose anything on anyone," replied Jake. His words carried the quiet conviction that had become his trademark among both allies and enemies. "We offer hope by example. We show what becomes possible when beings choose to serve something greater than their own interests." "And if they refuse your example," pressed Speaker Vorth, "if they prefer the old ways of logic and efficiency over your emotional appeals to heroism?" Jake was quiet for a long moment, considering his response carefully. Around him he could feel the assembled delegates waiting, with many hoping he would say something that would justify their fear of human idealism and intervention. "Then we protect their right to refuse," he said finally, "even if protecting that right costs us everything we have." The chamber erupted in surprised murmurs and confused discussions. This was not the answer anyone had expected from the leader of the Knights. "You would defend those who reject your path?" asked Vorth with genuine puzzlement in his artificial voice. "That is what knighthood means," replied Jake with absolute certainty. "We protect innocent beings not because they agree with us, but because they exist and have value. We serve justice not because it benefits us, but because it is right. We stand against darkness not because we are guaranteed to win, but because someone has to stand." The speech that followed would be remembered as one of the great moments in galactic history. Jake spoke about the 1,000 human volunteers who had requested night training, even though most would never be accepted because the path required a level of selflessness that few could sustain. He talked about former syndicate soldiers who had been freed from void influence and now worked to rebuild the worlds they had once helped destroy. He described children on Zephyria who had learned to see stars as symbols of hope rather than distant, uncaring lights. The galaxy forgot knights because it decided that practical compromises were more important than moral absolutes, Jake concluded. Maybe that was the right choice for an advanced civilization. Maybe the old ways were too hard and too demanding for a sophisticated universe. But if that is true, then explain this simple fact. Why did darkness and despair grow stronger every year after you abandoned those ways? Why did hopelessness spread like a plague until billions of beings simply stopped believing their lives had any meaning or purpose? He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. Perhaps the galaxy does not need knights. Perhaps you can build a perfect future based on efficient compromises and calculated self-interest. But until you prove that is possible, we will be here, standing watch in the darkness, keeping the light burning bright, ready to die for beings who think we are fools, because that is what love does when it finds something worth protecting. The vote was incredibly close, much closer than anyone had expected. By a margin of less than 1%, the Galactic Assembly officially recognized the Stellar Knights as a legitimate peacekeeping force, with humanity serving as their primary recruiting species. But as Jake left the assembly hall, he knew the real battle was just beginning. The Void Syndicate had been watching and learning from every encounter. They had just declared war not on any particular government or species, but on the very concept of hope itself. The final confrontation did not happen in normal space among stars and planets. It took place in the spaces between spaces, where thought and reality mixed together and where power could literally change what was possible. The Void Syndicate had built their ultimate weapon here, called the Oblivion Gate, and it threatened not just the galaxy but the very concept of meaning itself. Jake Morrison, now bearing the title of Knight Exemplar, led a force of 300 human knights into this strange realm. They were joined by volunteers from 47 different species, who had chosen to risk everything for the chance to preserve hope and purpose in the universe. The gate itself was like a wound cut into the fabric of existence. Through this massive tear poured not just darkness, but the complete absence of possibility. Jake could see the Void Syndicate's true nature through the opening. They were not aliens corrupted by despair, but actually manifestations of the universe's own tendency toward entropy and decay, given consciousness and evil purpose. They are not evil in the way we understand it, realized Amy Chun as they approached the threshold between realities. They are just tired. Tired of struggling and hoping and feeling the pain that comes with caring about anything at all. Which makes them the most dangerous enemy we have ever faced, replied Knight Commander Lisa. Grunt? Because part of every thinking being agrees with them deep down? The battle that followed was unlike anything in recorded galactic history. Knights wielded swords made of crystallized starlight against beings who attacked with weaponized despair and existential dread. Every blow exchanged was as much philosophical as physical. It was a contest between the belief that existence had meaning and the conviction that everything was ultimately pointless suffering. Jake found himself facing the Void Syndicate's supreme commander in single combat. This being had once been human, eons ago, before it surrendered completely to ultimate nihilism and became something else entirely. "You think you are saving them?" said the entity in a voice like dying stars. "But you are only making their suffering last longer. Let me show you the real truth about existence." The psychic assault that followed was more devastating than anything Jake had experienced. He saw every person he had failed to save during his career as a knight, every compromise he had been forced to make, every moment when his idealism had crashed against the brutal realities of an imperfect universe. He saw the futility of fighting entropy and the inevitable heat death that awaited all things. He witnessed the cosmic joke of consciousness arising in a universe that cared nothing for consciousness. But through all these visions of despair, Jake also saw something else that the Void entity could not understand. He saw Amy, barely 20 years old, standing over a fallen syndicate warrior and offering her hand to help them stand up. He saw Lisa choosing to protect a rationalist coalition delegate, even though that same delegate had called for her court-martial. He saw Paul working 18 hours a day to develop medical techniques that would help former syndicate soldiers recover their capacity for joy. He saw Susan using her intelligence networks not for personal advantage, but to identify populations in need of protection. You are absolutely right about everything, Jake said to the void entity as he raised his crystal sword one final time. The universe does not care about us. Stars die and civilizations fall and everything ends eventually. But that is exactly why what we do matters so much. Because we care even when nothing else does. Because we choose to create meaning in a meaningless cosmos. Because love is not defeated by being temporary. It is made precious and beautiful by being temporary. The final stroke was not one of destruction but of transformation. Jake's blade, blazing with the combined inner light of every knight who had ever lived, cut through the entity's despair and revealed what lay buried beneath. A soul so wounded by cosmic indifference that it had forgotten how to hope for anything. Good, I remember now, whispered the entity as the void corruption burned away like fog before sunrise. I remember why I became a knight in the first place all those ages ago. To protect the beautiful, foolish, doomed miracle of life that dares to love in the face of entropy and death. As the Oblivion Gate collapsed and reality healed itself, Jake realized that their victory was both complete and incomplete at the same time. They had proven that meaning could survive and even flourish in a universe that offered no guarantees. They had shown that love was stronger than entropy and hope could burn brighter than the heat death of stars. But they had also learned that this was not a battle that could be won once and then forgotten. Every generation would have to choose again whether to serve something greater than themselves. Every individual would have to decide whether to kindle their inner light or surrender to the comfortable darkness of not caring about anything. On the observation deck of the Honor Guard as they returned to Federation space, Jake watched new recruits practicing with their crystal swords. Most were humans, but there were also Zephyrians who had learned that songs could be prayers and Andromedans who had discovered that logic and love were not opposites. There were even former Rationalist Coalition members who had realized that efficiency without purpose was just another form of death. Do you think it will last? Asked Amy, joining him at the large viewing window. Jake smiled as he watched a young recruit finally managed to make his sword sing with inner light for the first time. Nothing lasts forever in this universe. But that is exactly the point. We do not serve the light because it is eternal and guaranteed to win. We serve it because it is fragile and needs us to protect it, because someone has to stand watch against the darkness. He paused, remembering Master Valdris's final words before the ancient knight had allowed himself to fade peacefully into whatever came after a life of perfect service to others. The stars forgot nights, Jake said quietly to Amy, but they remembered how to shine anyway. And as long as there are beings willing to kindle the light within themselves, the darkness will never completely win. Not because it cannot win, but because someone will always choose to strike a match and push back the shadows. Amy nodded, understanding perfectly what he meant. Around them throughout the ship, the knights continued their training and preparation for the battles that would surely come. Because there would always be new battles against despair and selfishness. There would always be darkness that needed to be held back by those brave enough to stand guard. There would always be a need for souls willing to protect others even at the cost of their own lives. The stars had forgotten knights, but humanity had brought them back. Not as they were before, but as they needed to be now. Guardians of hope in an age that had almost forgotten how to hope. Warriors who fought not for victory, but for the right of others to choose their own meaning and purpose in life. And in the depths of space, new crystal swords were being forged in ancient foundries, waiting for hands worthy to wield them in defense of everything good and beautiful and worth protecting in the universe.